carving your statue, withdraw into yourself and look. And if you do not find yourself beautiful yet, act as does the creator of a statue that is to be made beautiful. He cuts away here, he smooths there, he makes this line lighter, this other purer, until a lovely face has grown upon his work. So do you also. Cut away all that is excessive, straighten all that is crooked, bring light to all that is overcast. Labor to make all one glow of beauty, and never cease chiseling your statue until there shall shine out on you from it the godlike or goddess-like splendor of virtue. Plotinus.
Thank you ever so much, Jenny. And welcome to all of you to today's Gems from the Wisdom Traditions, where we are taking up the topic of service with a glad heart. This topic has been chosen because of the fact that this week we will be celebrating an Indian event called Hanuman Jayanti. So that's something like victory to Hanuman. Still a Moving Center every year for the Festival of Lights called Diwali celebrates the story behind Diwali, which is called the Ramayana. And in it, we have Rama, whose birthday we just had last week. And he's the crown prince and his princess Sita. And her birth is going to be celebrated next week as well. And then we have this beautiful hero who is so completely devoted to Rama that he has Rama right inscribed upon his heart. And so we are taking up this idea of service with a glad heart from this perspective of the Ramayana with the character of Hanuman. And the person who is going to be doing it is someone who I have watched for years rendering service with a glad heart, and always with such humility, never seeing what he's doing as being a big deal, even though so many of us who watch the things that he does in service, such as giving this presentation right after having done another important presentation just last week for the Institute of World Culture for Earth Day, for example. He just seems like such a perfect representative of this. I want to also read to you a quote from Shakespeare, whose birthday was yesterday. So we have all these interwoven kind of things going on in terms of celebration. And so this Shakespeare quote seems to embody this idea of service so beautifully. And it is the servant to King Lear speaking, saying, "Master, go on, and I will follow thee to the last gasp with truth and loyalty." So I give you Maurice Bisheff on the topic of service with a glad heart.
Okay. Oh, well, it's really great to be here, and I feel so comfortable in our group here that I could say things that I wouldn't necessarily say on the outside by any means. But we can kind of split this up first with the service and then the glad heart for a minute. When we say the word service, sometimes it can relate to so many other ideas. One major idea is it relates to sacrifice, because in a sense, that's what we're here on earth and what we do is render service to other people. I mean, we as human beings wouldn't be on earth unless our mothers and fathers gave us children and sacrificed and provided service in terms of support, nurturing, whatever help is needed. And Gandhi would say that the secret sauce, that's not his words, but the secret sauce to life, or the meaning to life, is selfless service. In other words, you don't think about yourself, but you think of the other person first. Now, the interesting thing about that, of course, is that when you provide service, you quickly learn that what you think is helpful may not be helpful. That in fact, while you may be trying to serve and using your best discernment, or maybe just your emotions, you just want to help, you have a good heart, right? It may or may not be effective, and furthermore, you may never know. But nonetheless, even as we know with raising children, right? You may not ever know as what you say may have an effect now, may have an effect later, may not have an effect at all. And maybe it's good that it didn't. Who knows? But nonetheless, we are kind of here to serve. Now, if we service also comes from the servant, from the idea of servant. And a servant tends to get a bad name because of all the abuse of servants that we've had in households, colonialism, oppression, etc. But being a servant is actually a very noble category. And from a religious point of view, being a servant to God is one of the most amazing and utmost things that one could even attempt to do. So service and servant is really very much linked. Now, in this context, I'm going to then talk about Hanuman, mostly from the Hindu tradition, and I'm not an expert. I just read a book and I've seen it, but I love Hanuman. So that's and Hanuman provides service with a glad heart. And I don't know if you could see this, it's kind of heavy, but like this, you can see Hanuman has a smile, and he also has his heart. So he's also a monkey in symbol, and yet he is loved throughout all of India. There are some temples in India where people are very devoted to Hanuman, the monkey god. But even if Hanuman is not their major god or their major devotional god, everyone loves Hanuman because of some of his exploits. So I'll try to summarize them briefly and kind of draw out some lines of service. So this monkey god now, and I'm just going to read a couple of sentences here. Hanuman is usually seen as a small monkey figure kneeling with joint palms beside Rama, Lakshmi, and Sita, who were the great gods 1 million years ago who established righteousness or dharma, or the right way to relate to people and to nature and to things. And he's also portrayed sometimes as tearing his chest open to show Rama's image in his heart. So in his heart, he would have Rama and Sita, and it's shown in his heart. Other times, though, he's flying through the sky with a Himalayan peak in his hand, long-haired, occasionally 5-headed, hands in fear-removing and wish-granting mudras, carrying a club, a bow, and a thunderbolt. But he was always devoted and providing devotion compassionate yet fierce, protector and remover of obstacles, giver of prosperity and destroyer of evil. All of these are Hanuman. Multifaceted, it is impossible to embrace every one of his manifestations in one sweep. So a lot of times when we see a person of a spiritual nature or godlike nature, they're usually calm. They have a sense of magnanimity. They may be in a sense of meditation. There's a continuity of consciousness, graciousness. But for Hanuman, unlike all the others, maybe, Hanuman is all over the map. And yet he teaches us a lot, and that's why he's loved by so many people in India. His image is that of a monkey god. And as we know, I think this image of the monkey god sort of shows a monkey mind. And the monkey mind is one that sort of flits from one thing to another. And a lot of times when you're trying to meditate, everyone knows kind of what that is, because you can't get your mind focused. It goes here, it goes there, something comes in, something goes out. So it's kind of it reflects kind of an instinctual personality and an agitated mind, and a little bit, you can say, of a fickleness. But back a million years ago, when at least the myth was propagated, there were many what was called yakshas, of beings, gods, who can assume any format at will. And so I'm sure you've seen many animal-headed deities in Greece and in other myths as well. So Hanuman, it depends how you look at Hanuman. And you can look at him as a god, or you can look at him as animal, human-like creature, but who is a perfect vessel of devotion to God. And as a result, at certain times and in certain places, all of a sudden, Hanuman takes on all these other shapes, forms, and powers because of the single-minded devotion to God. And Rama even said that even more than his brother Lakshmana, that Rama was even more devoted to him, because Rama was not related. Hanuman was not related to King Rama by birth, but was so devoted. So I'll go over the story briefly, and then we can pick some of the characteristics of what this devotion was like. So basically, King Rama and his wife Sita were in the forest. They had to go to the forest because they were exiled from the kingship for a while at least. And while they're in the forest, Sita got kidnapped by Ravana, the king, the competing king, and was taken away. And so Rama and his brother Lakshmana didn't know quite what to do, so they started wandering the forest. And it's there that they came upon the monkey army with their own king, the monkey king, which was Valen. And a minister to Valen was Sugriva. And this was sort of the monkey kingdom. And Hanuman was an advisor. And they came, and all of a sudden, Rama came and met them. And the them are actually called Raghavas, according to this book. And nothing quite happened right away, but Hanuman instinctively knew that they had to get the King Valen kind of out of the way so that Sugriva could take over, so they can help find Sita and save Sita from the evil king. So basically, uh, there was kind of a tacit understanding and then kind of an alliance. And then pretty soon, Hanuman and King Rama, Hanuman the monkey god and Rama, even though they didn't say it explicitly because they were in their forms, they weren't in their formless aspects, they were in their form, meaning like monkey and human, etc. But inside they kind of knew that, and Rama knew that Hanuman was going to be Rama's perfect instrument. And so so Hanuman put out the word with the monkey armies that they had to find Sita. And Rama knew in his wisdom that nature would tell him where Sita was. And in fact, nature did, because it was an old vulture who saw in the air Ravana flying in the air, abducting Sita and taking her to the city of Lanka. And that information then allowed the monkeys to tell Rama where Sita was so they could rescue her. And so they get to southern India. Sri Lanka, as you know, is a country in southern India, and Lanka was the place. And so somehow they still have to know where Lanka is. So Hanuman flies across the ocean. It's not that he flew all the time every place, but as I said, he's kind of unpredictable in this way. But he was so devoted to Rama and so devoted to finding the Sita that he was like totally single-minded, 100% heart in this direction. So he flies across the ocean, and then you have the kind of the two aspects of Hanuman, and because in all these Hindu myths, there are always more than one interpretation. And one interpretation would say that Hanuman, being godlike, sort of intuitively knew pretty quickly where Sita was. But if you think of him not as a god man, but a man god, a man with a vessel that can, where God energies can flow, then as the man, when Hanuman got over there to find Sita, he didn't know where it was. He was starting to freak out. I don't know, but maybe I'll talk to somebody. Maybe, well, they're going to capture me because she's guarded with everything. So I better make myself as small as an ant. But I don't know. I don't know where she is. So maybe I also have to be a human being and talk to someone and find out. But God, I don't know what I'm going to do. So it just depends what version you want. Or it's maybe a combination of both, I suspect. But anyway, he did find that there were devotees because he was so devoted to Rama, King Rama. He found other devotees through mutual attraction, even on the island of Sri Lanka. And one of them was a close relative of the demon Ravana, who told him where Sita was. So he had brought a ring to, once he found where Sita was. But in typical Rama fashion, he saw Sita and other ladies in this compound. Again, if you go with the godlike interpretation, he immediately knew who she was. But if you go with the man interpretation, he was kind of freaking out, like, let's see, does she really look like Sita? Or man, what do you got? Oh man, yeah, her legs are like Sita's, as I recall, and all that. Okay, well, I got to get my act together here. Yeah, I think that's Sita. And then he goes, and of course, Sita herself, who's sort of doing a lot of penance, actually, isn't in her Sunday best, let's put it that way. And all of a sudden, this being appears. And so Sita at first kind of wonders who it is, but then when she sees the ring speaks to her, and Rama actually speaks through this ring. So, which is a relief to Hanuman because he doesn't want to try to have to explain what's going on. You know, who is he? But anyway, she does eventually tend to believe him. But pretty soon, he either lets himself be caught or he is caught by the guards. And eventually he goes before Ravana. And Ravana wants to punish him. So he sets his tail on fire because he's in his monkey form. And that really hurts regular monkeys. But Ravana decided, oh, you're going to set my tail on fire? Well, I'm going to wag this tail around in my godlike way. And basically, he burnt down the whole city of Lanka with his tail on fire because pretty soon everything burnt down. And finally, they just said, we've had enough of you, and let him go. And so he went back to Rama and let him know where Sita was. But when he went back, he found that a lot of especially the monkey army that he had amassed to go to Lanka and engage in this big battle with all the people in Lanka, the people that support Ravana. And they were all kind of sick. And they caught something. And so he was told, well, you have to get this herb and you can find to get everyone well. That's going to be a big task because you have to go to the Himalayas, which is in northern India. They're in southern India. This is a subcontinent. So Hanuman says, hey, no problem. I'm going to do it because we have to get this done. Single pointed devotion to Rama. So he flies to the Himalayas, finds the mountain, but then all of a sudden, again, oh, I'm here in the mountain, but got all these plants, they all kind of look alike. You know, like, I don't know what herb, what's this herb thing? You know, I don't know. So he decides, well, forget all this. I'm just going to take the whole mountain back. So he picks up the whole mountain and takes it back. And then the folks that knew what the herbs were back in southern India actually use the herb. The army gets ready, but he's very, very famous. It's a very famous Hanuman act of, well, I really quite don't know what's going on, but I'm so devoted to the Lord that that's not going to stop me. I'm just going to take the whole thing back. So you can now see how he's loved by the common people in India for his tremendous devotion, his tremendous risk-taking in a way, but at the same time, his humanness, almost monkey mind character. Anyway, everyone gets well and he leads the charge in the battle. And finally, and Rama follows him, and Rama eventually, as you probably know, reconnects with Sita, and then Rama does battle with Ravana, the demon, and wins, and Rama and Sita go back to India, and Dharma, or order, or duty, is restored. But Hanuman then shows a number of characteristics of service, but service on behalf of the divine, single-pointed, and it shows that if you have that kind of motive, whatever you might mess up, whatever you don't know quite what's going on, you do the best you can, and you just leave it up to, because you're not the one necessarily doing it all. In fact, you may not be doing much of anything. You may just be a vessel for the Shakti or the energy of the Lord. So this is a tremendous example of service with a glad heart, because he always, to the end, was devoted to Rama and Sita. And so he was unconditional. And the notion of being unconditional is when you can have joy and have the heart quality really come out. If you're conditional about service, that, oh yeah, I really should help these people, but I'm not sure about them. I don't know if I trust them, but I'm giving, then you're back into a conditional mode, and you may not have that. You may be doing service, but you won't be doing it necessarily with a glad heart. But if you're doing it on behalf of the Lord, and you're single pointed, and you have a motive, yes, you do have to think it through a little bit. But in Hanuman's case, he just went for it. He provided then a bridge between the unconditional and the conditional. That all of us are conditional to the most part because we're humans. And Hanuman, as I mentioned in the story, went through all his conditions. Should I do this? Should I not? I don't know. But at the same time, he was also the bridge to something higher, the unconditional devotion, the absolute devotion. Sometimes people could call it the spiritual self. Others can call it God, whatever you want to call it. But he never forgot that. Even though he teetered and tattered and wavered, and they always, in the end, came back to it. And so he's just loved. So I just have a couple more things to say, and then we can then have a discussion about service with a glad heart. Let's see. One of them is something about devotion. And this actually comes from the theosophical tradition, but I think it really has a influence here. Devotion is not just a feeling. It is action for the object of devotion, not for oneself. Mere professions of love for humanity or love for great teachers will not bloom into sacrifice for them. Practical action for them will, for we cannot act for ourselves and for others at the same time. Hence the two, ourselves and they, must become one. And then I'd just like to end with what Hanuman said to his Lord, Sri Rama. When I identify myself with the body, O Lord, I am thy creature, eternally separate from thee. When I identify myself with the soul, I am a spark of that divine fire which thou art. But when I identify myself with the Atma, which is the universal in everyone, I and thou art one. This is Hanuman to Sri Rama. So I'll just say that one more time. When I identify myself with the body, O Lord, I am thy creature, eternally separate from thee. When I identify myself with the soul, I am a spark of that divine fire which thou art. But when I identify myself with the Atman, I and thou are one. And so we give our oblations to God and the Supreme Spirit, and to whatever manifestations, including Rama, Sita, and Hanuman today. Thank you.
Oh, beautiful. Thank you so much. It's always so heartwarming to hear a good story with great heroes. I think it brings out a certain childlike nature in each of us that loves to hear stories, and perhaps is a little less reluctant to give service. We all probably have experienced little children who see their parents or some other adult whom they love at work, and it's their greatest joy to help. How can I help you? Can I dig in the garden with you? I remember my two youngest children. I came upon them in the kitchen, sitting up on the counter on either side of the kitchen sink, and they had the wash bucket that I used to wash the floors, like in the bathroom and so on. And they said, "Look, Mom, we're washing dishes for you." And they had all my dishes in the wash bucket, but there was just such this willing, devoted heart that showed through, that I just hugged them and thanked them so much for their glad service. So you reminded me of that childlike nature that I think is behind this glad service, and it is quite selfless.
I don't know if people have had these Hanuman-like experiences in their life. I've actually had a few, which is probably why I identify and enjoy it. One experience with Jenny shared with me when we've been to Ukraine several times, but the first time we didn't quite know what we were doing. We were invited, and so we just went. And we went because we saw YouTube of people working on a temple, if you will. And their bright faces were such that when we met a couple people who told us about it, the YouTube, we decided, well, let's just go. But we didn't know what we were going to face. We knew the Russians were about 2 hours away. And of course, right now they got 150,000 troops that are 2 hours away today. But we wanted to go to support those people. So we just went, and it was okay going through customs. They had a couple of jet fighters out there. They looked like one of my old model airplanes. Probably could operate like my model airplane too, but nonetheless, it's kind of like war footing and stuff. But it turned out we had a wonderful time, and they were so glad to see people. Well, maybe especially Americans, because they've had a couple Europeans, but Americans are just afraid to go. You're going there, why? It's dangerous, and all that. But we went, and we had a wonderful time. And in the end, they gave us some gifts, and so we went and they escorted us to the airport, because they didn't know if a taxi would actually get us to the airport, if you know what I mean. And so we went through customs and all that, and everything's fine. And I remember going through customs, and I was kind of happy. I was also happy kind of to get out of kind of the pressure of having to deal with all that stuff, And two, and all of a sudden, the guards there, customs, they called me back. Hey, please come here. And people who were just sitting around doing nothing, actually, all of a sudden were standing up, and it was a big deal. And I walked over to see what they wanted from me, what the commotion was. And it turns out that one of the gifts that they wrapped, I didn't pay that much attention to it. But instead of these Matryoshka dolls, the doll and the doll and the doll, instead, at least they gave me what's kind of like a vajra, which is a big club. And it's painted in Ukrainian style because and all that, but it's a big club. And they just couldn't get over. And there was all this discussion. They're talking Russian or Ukrainian, I don't know, but they're pointing to the club. And I just started laughing because I couldn't, I didn't really know anything. I just happened to be there, literally. And then finally, they just said, you just can't take this on the plane. And luckily, our friends hadn't left. They were there to see us off through customs. And so once they discovered that our friends were there, then they wrapped up the vajra, this thing, and we couldn't take it. But they went back and then handed over the fence to our friends. And that was it. And everyone was laughing. The guards were laughing and smiling. Our friends were smiling. once Jenny and I figured out what was going on, we were laughing too. We didn't know what was going on because they were speaking in Russian and stuff. So that's kind of a Hanuman moment in the sense that you're building a bridge. And in this case, it reminded me of something that you might do at a temple, especially a Hindu temple, where you'll give an offering, the priest bless it and gives it back to you. So in this case, the Vajra came and it was blessed by the guards and all that. And instead of it being ours, it was given back to them because they certainly need a lot of support. So anyway, that's just a story that's kind of like, reminds me of a Hanuman-like thing where the whole thing really doesn't make much sense in the first place. But somehow everyone all of a sudden winds up with service with a glad heart. Everyone was smiling. The guards were smiling. I think the guards learned something too. I didn't say anything. Anyway, have any of you ever had these kinds of experiences where you wind up building a bridge or crossing a boundary or something, and something happens, but it turns out everyone really kind of enjoys the whole thing or learns something?
I was also, the whole, one of the aspects about Hanuman that's discussed a lot is that, as you mentioned, this capacity for bridge building, and that whole story about the impassable waterway that that Hanuman and the bears and the monkeys created so that Rama and his cohorts could cross, and the whole, I mean, there's a whole cycle of stories that goes along with that. And one of the things that is, I think that Hanuman characterizes, besides this, as you pointed out, this like total willingness and sort of bravery in the face of what seem like insurmountable obstacles, and vigor, right? It's the whole idea that you find in the Paramitas, for example, of virya, this dauntless energy, right? It's just, it's not giving up. There's no question about it, but also this like strategic insight, right? That and there's many instances where he sees he has this capacity to see exactly what needs to be done and what can be done, and this like precision in the performance of what he sees as his duty. And so the question it brings to mind is because we all have very busy lives. We could say like competing duties, competing dharmas, and decisions to make about what's more important to do, what should I be doing right now, and so on. And Hanuman seems to exemplify this like, laser-like focus and strategic precision about what he should be doing right then. So I was just wondering, how does one develop that? How does one clarify? What is the process of clarifying that, what is my duty? What is my dharma to be performing? And what is it I should be doing at any given time?
Yeah, that's a good question, Kirk. I think it really comes from the godlike part of Hanuman, because Hanuman is viewed as a god in India. And so there is a kind of, if not omniscience, certainly a very high degree of discernment and detachment. And I think it's very reminiscent to me of the Tao Te Ching in Chinese philosophy, where you're not the doer. The Tao just does what it does, meaning the spirit. And so you don't have to over control it. You don't have to get too involved in it. You just let the Tao kind of do its thing. But you do it not by just forgetting about everything, but through a high degree of discernment and detachment. But detachment it's detached engagement. You're not detached, but in Hanuman, of course, the thing is that he he does mix his emotions and his passions. He's very passionate. He's very emotional, and that's what confounds everything, right? Unlike all the other gods, and maybe unlike the Chinese sage, the Tao, around sage that's very has equanimity, he's kind of all over the map. But what through his bhakti yoga or through his devotion, he becomes a pure vessel of intelligence and energy. And so that strategic spark of knowing what to do and when to do it at the right time, at the right place, eventually is there. Some people think it's there all the time. What makes him interesting is that a lot of people think it's not there a lot of time, but when it has to be there, that's there because he has a continuous 100% pure devotion to the highest. And he can count on that all the time. And so while he can veer from it, and does in some accounts, right? He's so devoted that that's his constitutional nature, the nature of his constitution, and nothing's gonna breeze him away. So he can go off the deep end, but his real constitution will not let him fail in his devotion to Rama and Sita, to the Lord. So that's the only way I can answer your good question.
When Cliff and I, my husband Cliff, and I got back from India, he had this strange experience of feeling as if during the weeks we had been there, he had been living from and communicating to everyone with and from everyone with his heart. And when he got back to the US, he felt as if he had like popped up to everybody operating from a head space. And so he couldn't feel that same relationship with others that he had felt when he was in India. And there is something so much about this heart quality of Hanuman's, and that is part of the iconography. The image of Hanuman is he's shown, like unveiling his heart to show the image of Ram and sometimes Rama and Sita on it. And there's a part of, I think he shows that at least in one aspect of the story. He's given Rama's bracelet, which is supposed to be such, this huge sign of Rama's esteem for Hanuman and for his service. And he looks at the bracelet and he just throws it on the ground. It means nothing to him. And people say, well, why did you throw that away? He said, because there's no name of Ram on it. And that's when he bears his heart and shows that Ram's name is written all over his heart. And so I'm wondering, in regard to Kirk's question, whether this clear perception of what it is that we need to do in the moment has to do with us connecting more to our hearts. And instead of trying to figure things out, gee, I wonder what I'm supposed to do now. That never got Hanuman anywhere. He was always confused if he went up to his head. But as soon as we drop into the heart, or if we go to a deeper aspect of our nature, sometimes it feels as if we're just shown the way and we just know. And kind of living in the heart maybe is this matter of trusting what comes to us in that way, those flashes, like, and hold on to those, even if they seem like, what? That doesn't make any sense at all. And yet there's something maybe that we've been shown, something that we've been gifted, that if we do have that trust in our deeper intuitions that come from wanting to do the very best that we possibly can on behalf of the whole, on behalf of humanity, on behalf of the divine, however we verbalize that, that we want that so much that we can trust those flashes that come when we're open to them.
And I think to add to what you say is, when we can do that, we become more selfless. And it gets back to even Gandhi's idea of selfless service, right? Serving others. You're so devoted to doing good for the divine, on behalf of the divine, not on behalf of yourself, that yourself begins to dissolve. Doesn't necessarily go away, but it starts to dissolve itself. So, and maybe this has to do, and we were discussing this the other day in another Zoom, about what growth is. You know, growth, how do you grow, especially spiritually, where you have to maybe regulate your passions and your desires and your impulses and your appetites. But that may not be enough. You know, growth usually occurs when you begin to outgrow something. And when you outgrow it, you don't want it as much because you're on to something else. Children do this all the time, right? Eventually you outgrow your teddy bear and you outgrow something. And so when you really start to, as Renee was saying, trust your heart, and then more and more of your attention, your real true self, your real attention is there, sooner or later, that's going to begin to take over. And it's going, and you're going, and other things, including faults, will soften and eventually go away. It may take a life. I'm not saying it's going to be quick, because I don't know, everyone's so different. But so I think strong bhakti, a strong devotion, it just has to be very pure and true. And I think, but it has to have that essence of selflessness. And that's the rub, because it's easy to fool ourselves, to think that, oh, if all I go is go to the temple or the church, and you know, and even though I have a heartfelt prayer, but then that's it. That may not be enough. But if your mind continues to go back to the Lord, to go back to that which is the highest and best in you, in your heart, which is the universal, and not the particular, not the cribbed, confined, conflicted, the fickle, but rather the heart is universal. The heart expands. The heart loves. It expands. And so the more and more one does that, the trick, of course, is to just have a pure motive. And that's very tricky, because we like to fool ourselves thinking we're doing good. But we can try, and we can try. And like Hanuman messes up all the time, but he goes back and saves himself. And that's why there's so much joy around Hanuman. And why the common people in India, whether they take him or others as their superior deity, still love Hanuman. He was like all in.
What do you think, Sarah?
Thank you, Maurice. That really sat well, and that was really well said. Kind of bringing up a lot of different thoughts as you were speaking, and I guess what came out the most or came up was that we have that choice, that we have a choice to walk every step in service, really, and in service of that devotion and walking our path towards deepening, ever deepening devotion. And so we're constantly faced with this choice, whether we realize it or not. Are we going to walk this next step or breathe this next breath with that? Or do we go back? Kind of the alternative feels like a metal cage. And it's really, for me, it feels like one or the other. And I often, out of habit, out of training, out of whatever laziness, go back into the cage and then come back to that choice of the field, which really feels like it is devotion, it is service, and it is unknown. There's a huge element of trust of where does this next footfall go? What does it look like? But I love that we have that choice and that it can be joyful, like Hanuman shows us. So, thank you.
Mary?
Aloha, Maurice. Thank you again. It reminds me, I think about how many things I've been through in my life, and service at different times of my life are extremely different. And hopefully we get better as time goes by. I liked what you said about, our children and how we do things. And sometimes we see a result, sometimes we don't. And that brings up things I've read in the Bible and with the Hawaiian culture, is that you plant a seed and you may be able to reap the fruit and you may not, but somebody else will. So it's very uplifting, and thank you. Aloha.
Thank you. I think it's a really good point about, you don't have to do it yourself. In fact, you're not doing it yourself. That's the whole point.
Mm.
That there's a whole devotional field. Hanuman didn't do it. He had all these monkeys, and he had Rama. He had a whole field of people. So thank you for your comment that, you can plant the seed, but maybe someone else will be the one that actually plants the seed that seems to work.
How about Farba?
Thank you so much, both Renee and everybody else. I was thinking as questions came in that just to be willing to be a chalice and close and look with alertness what is need to be done or prepared, just lead us to the next step. And it was so wonderful, all the stages of the story, the devotion that you mentioned, Maurice, the readiness, going ahead and see what's the problem and what is needed, just taking a deep dive within the story that you explained so beautifully. I thought it's just to be the clear vessel of the service. It looked like includes all of these other steps within it. And Renee mentioning to dropping into the heart level, and then the service, Maurice, you mentioned, comes from there. They all beautiful reminder for us. And I think it's beautiful to come together because we need to be reminded, even though we have lived it and have example, but just having each other in a circle and be reminded of all these steps and the intention of the children wanting to help, but choosing the wrong bucket. So all is very wonderful and delicious. Thank you.
Why do you think it is that, I mean, you mentioned some of the abuses of servants, and you mentioned colonialism, but is there, I'm just wondering about this concept of being a servant getting such a bad rap, and how we feel about that. I do want to note that there are so many problems with Americans. There's something evidently though that we do really well, is that we have a very cheerful service industry that a lot of other people can't quite believe is genuine. So if people, for example, from Europe come here and they have this kind of buoyant American greeting them at the restaurant or at their hotel, they feel like, oh, well, that can't be real. And, and yet, in fact, that is evidently something that typifies genuinely some of the service in America, and certainly here on the islands. It was really interesting for me to be here on the islands where I have experienced so much joy of service and so much aloha, and then to go to restaurants in Chinatown where I had wait staff who seem to be directly from mainland China. And there was such a sternness about them and just what do you want kind of attitude that I realized, wow, maybe to them, if they have come from communist China and they were brought up, these are people like my age, sometimes older, if they were brought up that we're all supposed to be comrades and we're all equal, there's no more of this leveling in society anymore. That's what communism did away with. Then there's no need for this kind of deference, maybe that they would associate with these old, more hierarchical structures that communism was to have done away with. I just think that there is a certain sweetness when we do encounter someone in a position to render service, who does it joyfully. It could be somebody over the phone that is helping us with our internet service or with our bank deposit or whatever. It makes such a big difference when I hear this willingness to try to be of help. I may have to leave this as a question unanswered. I am noticing that it's 4 p.m. and I noticed that I know that Maurice is actually going to be conducting another meeting in 15 minutes from now. So he told me he was going to have to leave right at the top of the hour. And Maurice, just please allow me to say on behalf of all of us how much we were absolutely tickled by, delighted by your storytelling, and not just of Hanuman, but your own experiences, for example, in the Ukraine. And it truly, I think, inspired all of us to be open to this possibility of being true servants, and especially servants of the divine. So thank you all so much for attending, and Maurice especially for presenting today.
Thank you so much, and thank you all for being here. Thank you.